Hi, this is Australian Real. I'm Tony Inman, and my guest today is Suresh Rajan. Suresh, welcome.
Good to be here, Tony.
Excellent. My guest Suresh today has gone through some major challenges in life, but has still managed to do some incredibly good things in the community. So we're going to hear something of his journey, and I'd like to start with, if we could perhaps give us a sense of what you do today, Suresh, because you have a very busy calendar.
Actually, a very busy calendar, doing lots of things. Look, I guess if you had to boil down to certain areas that I work in, I do a lot of work in the disability space. But a lot of that work that I do in the disability space now started out as being work in the race and multicultural space. So then I started to, and then because of the various conditions that have impacted on me, I now find myself as a person with disability, and therefore a person who also is looking to assist other people who have disability and other people who are potentially from other countries and who have difficulty with the language or just integration into the community.
So I first met you, I recall, Suresh, when you were in your position at the chairman or CEO of the Epilepsy Association.
Yes, it was a time when we were dealing with all sorts of issues around epilepsy, and again, that was a space that looked at people who were disadvantaged there, in that they were disadvantaged from the point of view of having a condition that was quite severe, quite impacted, and yet they were not being recognized as being people with disabilities. And that's something that I have found quite hard to come to terms with. Even in Western Australia, a small population like ours, there are 25,000 people with epilepsy. And that's a significant number. So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space, but it goes back to the issue of trying to make sure that these people who are people with a condition are treated as human beings and accorded all of the human rights that they're entitled to.
We've certainly experienced some of that in our own family with getting authorities to understand the condition and to be able to define it in a way that made sense to them.
And if I went back to my time as CEO of the Epilepsy Association, I went back and found one item that I felt that I was really proud about, that I'd managed to actually achieve in this state, was the fact that I dragged the health minister kicking and screaming to the point of view of considering pediatric trials for the use of medical marijuana in the treatment of epilepsy. And that came about because I was dealing with people who had children who had anything between 300 and 500 seizures a day, and yet we'd run out of options to treat them with mainstream medicine. And it took me a long time. It took me 5 years of constant badgering of the then Health Minister Kim Hames, and we managed to get him over the line to agree to have trials done at Princess Margaret Hospital, now Perth Children's Hospital. But that was probably the greatest achievement. But it just struck me at that point that why should we not allow people to have access to medications, treatments that are potentially going to be life-saving? And that's what drove me in that instance.
Well, you're certainly preaching to the converted there. I've watched numerous documentaries about the successful impact of medical marijuana in the United States, and seeing documentaries of children that have gone from 300 seizures a day down to just a few, which is life-changing. I mean, that's someone who can't function as a human being going to someone who can draw, for example, for a child. So that's amazing. So you've never been backwards in coming forwards when it comes to taking on the big issues, have you?
Look, I guess it comes about from starting work in media many years ago. I started doing some work on one of the radio stations, doing finance reports and what was happening in markets overseas. And I suddenly realized the power of media. And I found that the way I deal with media, for example, is being completely open, completely upfront. Then there are no dangers that are lurking in my background that people can sit down and start to dig up and throw at me. And that then allowed me to take the high moral ground, because I could then say, well, hang on a second, you are saying this, but you are not doing this. So it became a case of being able to harness the power of the media. And I found that the best way to harness the power of media is just being completely open and being completely truthful about everything you say. And that then also gave you that position to take ministers to task. I'm always amused by that, the description of me as being not scared to come forward. There is a friend of mine who works in this space as well, and I admire greatly her tenacity and her ability to take apart an argument very effectively. And she says that one of the things she admires about me is that we can be sitting in a room with a minister or a member of parliament of some kind sitting up at the top, and she will watch me sit there and dissect the person's argument and absolutely crucify the minister, and the minister feels like they deserved it. And they actually
Excellent.
appreciate being crucified, so it works well.
What was that quote about telling someone to go to hell and look forward to the journey?
That's the one. But look, I think it also goes to that space that I adopted fairly early in the piece in the race area. One thing that I learned very early in the piece was that if Joe Bloggs goes out there and performs an act of racism, there is actually absolutely nothing to be gained from my perspective to get Joe Bloggs out there and call him a racist. Because all you're going to do by doing that is to actually entrench his views and get him to defend his views. I don't want that. What I want to do is ignore the person like Joe Bloggs, because I'm not going to be able to change their views. There is a bunch of people out there who work in that race space who will always be racist, irrespective of what I do, irrespective of what everyone else does. So what I want to concentrate on is to look at government services that are actually systemic in their discrimination. So, they systemically discriminate against people from Aboriginal descent, or they systemically discriminate against people who come from a non-English speaking background. If I can change the system, then I've achieved some recompense, I guess. But so it goes to that whole state of saying, look, I'm dealing with a system rather than an individual, and there is nothing wrong with attacking a system that is racist. I can do that comfortably without impacting on anyone in particular.
Well, I think one of the greatest examples of the great levelling act of humanity.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter what your colour, what your race, your creed. You experienced something that was life-changing or life-defining fairly recently. Would you perhaps like to share a little bit about that?
In terms of my illnesses?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, it's now about 6 years ago. I was feeling like I was working at the Epilepsy Association. At that stage, I would go into the office every morning and find that I was short of breath just getting up and walking, a few meters to the door. And my wife put up with that for about 2 weeks and said, look, enough is enough. We're going to the doctor. And is archetypal of most men. I'm one of those people that says, look, don't worry about it. It'll cure itself, etc. Anyway, got to the doctor. The doctor did some tests and walked away into the other room, came back a few seconds later and said, look, it's 5:30 now. An ambulance will be arriving in a few minutes to take you into hospital. And I asked why, and she said, well, you've had a heart attack and you're likely to have another one. So off I went to the hospital, went in the next day for angiograms, etc., diagnosed to require a quadruple bypass. So a week later I had a quadruple bypass, went home after that, and was struggling with various issues of tiredness, got some blood tests done, white cell count all over the place. Back into the hospital, 3 weeks of testing of various kinds. It actually got to the point where I just said to the doctor, I don't want any more tests. I've had colonoscopies, endoscopies, laparoscopies, every possible scope. I don't want any more. I just want to be left alone. And the doctor was just quite remarkable. He just said, look, I've got one more test tomorrow. And he came back the next afternoon and said, look, we've actually discovered a cancer. You've got a cancer in your stomach. It's not very big. We'll deal with it like we do with most polyps. We'll chop it up, take it out through your mouth. But it's, we're about a couple of weeks away from Christmas. Let's wait till January and we'll deal with it then. So come January, I come back in on the 18th of January, and they go to open up my body to look at this little growth, and there's a growth about the size of a grapefruit. So this cancer had doubled in size every second day to the point where it was huge. And it was spread to about 21 lymph nodes around my stomach. It was a grade 4 cancer. It was basically a go home to die cancer. And essentially 7 out of the 8 doctors told me that I was going home to die. And my time frame was around about 6 months. I sat my then 9 and 7-year-old children down, my 2 boys, and said to them, look, Dad's going to die, and you guys are going to have to deal with looking after Mum and doing all the things that you need to do. And they proceeded to do a gastrectomy, removed most of my stomach, then treated me with chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Chemotherapy from 9 till 2 every day, radiotherapy from 2 till 3, 42 sessions of that spread over 6 weeks. So it's basically 7 days, but it was 5 days a week, and I had the weekends off. So did that.
So for someone who's normally so busy and so active, you suddenly were stopped completely in your tracks by this illness.
Yeah, and it was quite an interesting issue there, Tony. I would get phone calls from various people asking for comments about different things because they didn't know that I was in hospital, so they'd ring me to make a comment about some racism issue, multiculturalism issue. And I sat there and I thought about it, and I said to one of them at one point, what are you going to do and who are you going to talk to if I'm not here? And the response was, well, we're not sure. And I thought, look, there's a lot of work to be done. There's an awful lot of people to be helped. And who's going to do it if I'm not here? So there was a sense that there are people there who rely on me and who are looking for help from me. And my moving on, shuffling off the mortal coil, would actually be a breach of their trust. And I thought, no, I can't do that because I'm here to help them. And I will continue to help them until the last breath goes.
So that sense of a greater purpose for humanity drove you through, kept you going?
And I've often looked at my father as an example in that, and his philosophy in life was very much around, if you have a totem pole of status in society, at the very top level of that status is your community. Your next level down is your family, and your last level is yourself. So when you think about it, and reason Dad thought along those lines was to say, if you're in trouble, it's likely that your family is also in trouble, whatever it may be, but financially or whatever. So the only people who can help you are your community. So therefore, always place your community as your top level of priority. So my approach has always been about making sure that people in the community are well looked after. Because if I'm in trouble, they'll look after me. I know that. So if my family's in trouble, they'll look after me. That's not to minimize what my family does for me. My family does an incredible amount to allow me to do those things. But my philosophy is driven around the fact that, I can go out and help a bunch of refugees, or I can go out and help a bunch of people with disability, knowing full well that my family supports me in doing that, because that's what I get my satisfaction from. And that is also how I view life as being, we're all here in a community, whatever that community may be, and you define the community you belong to. That may be a whole group of people with disability. That may be a whole group of people from the Indian subcontinent, whatever it may be, a whole bunch of people who live in Perth. So it's all about those people who form that community, and I will help that community. And I belong to a variety of different communities. I work in the disability community, I work in the race community. So in all of those communities, I see the community as being paramount, and I will do everything to make sure that everyone in that community is assisted as much as they require. And all of us have the capacity to help others, and that's something that I will never take for granted, that it's everyone is happy with their lot. There are lots of people out there, and even just in terms of my own journey, I look at what I've had to deal with, and I often regard myself as very lucky in the sense that I actually don't think I realized how sick I was, and there are doctor friends of mine who
So hang on, you've been told to go home and say goodbye to your kids,
Yep.
and you didn't realise how sick you were.
And because I think I had this concept in my mind that, I'm one of these people that, okay, look, I've got something wrong, take it out, and I can keep going. So it was the clear vision that, okay, once you've got the cancer out of my body, then what's to worry? And I'm as you may know, Tony, I'm an inveterate walker, and if I'm feeling unwell, I'll walk an extra 10 kilometers just to get rid of that illness. So it's
Whereas most people would do the opposite and go and curl up on the couch.
yeah. So it's I guess that this philosophy that yes, illness is there, but it's very short term. And I remember thinking at the time also that look, I dealt with a few people from from refugee backgrounds at that time, and I remember hearing their stories and thinking, these are people, and also people with epilepsy who I dealt with at that time, and I remember thinking, those are conditions that may live with you forever. Mine is a condition that I can get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it takes to get rid of it, whether it's surgery, whether it's medication, whether it's chemotherapy, whether it's radiotherapy, whatever it is, potentially it could be removed. Now, 6 years later, I'm in remission. So they can't find traces of the cancer last they looked. I'm all right. So those are the things that drive me. And it's I guess it's yes, I have conditions, but those are relatively minor when I look at what I deal with when I deal with people with disabilities who may have conditions that will impact on them all their lives, when I deal with people who are unable to verbalize, unable to walk. And that verbalization one is also quite an interesting one. One of the things that they've expressed to me is that because of issues around my esophagus and the motility of my esophagus and my voice box, it is highly likely that in time I will lose the ability to speak. Now, for someone who has relied on radio and the medium of radio for a long time, the medium of the spoken word, I initially took that to heart and wondered how I'd deal with it. Then I spent some time with people with disabilities who are non-verbal, who talk to me via their iPad. And I communicate with 1 million people every day via Facebook, via Twitter, via,
I've noticed you being fairly active there.
That's right. So SMS is good. So I can convey everything I want to by the written word. So why is the spoken word that important? I can verbalize in ways that don't impact on the message itself. So I began to think about it and thought, look, so now I just work on the philosophy that, look, that's what they say is going to happen to me. I'll deal with it when it happens. My mum makes the point, of course, that every other diagnosis that has been thrown at me has been proven incorrect, so why would I worry about this one? So it is an interesting one.
There's another interesting point that came out of that, just hearing you speak there, was that very often with people with facing disabilities or facing difficult situations health-wise,
Yep.
would tend to go very much the opposite to the way you've approached it, and focus inwardly on themselves and become the centre of their own universe. It's all about me, it's all about my illness and everything I'm having to deal with. You've done the complete opposite. You've gone, never mind me, what about all these other people I've got to help? It's fascinating.
I must say, it also took me to that space where I began to question the whole issue around disclosure by doctors. You know, when doctors disclose that you have a limited time, you generally put yourself in the time frame to work to that limit. So they say to you, you've got 3 months. So you work towards this view that in 3 months' time you'll be gone.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely.
There's another point I wanted to just ask you on that too, is that, you know, would you prefer, you've been right to the edge and back, would you prefer to know when your time is coming, or would you rather it just be sprung on you? It's one of those age-old questions.
Look, I would prefer it be sprung on me because I want to deal with, I guess, to live life to the fullest, expecting that this is not going to happen. So I want to get the most out of today without suggesting that today is going to be the last day. So I just want to keep going, and then it may come a point where suddenly, physically, I'm unable to do those things, and that's the point at which I will sit back and say, well, I think I've done my bit. But it's in terms of the self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, you know, far too often I've seen people who go into that space where they become morose around the issue of trying to deal with this condition, trying to deal with the unfinished business, and that's what then makes them even more depressed and more into that space of saying, I don't have a purpose in life. I want to have a purpose in life right up until the time they light the cremation fires around me. You know, I want to be able to say, I influenced the Premier on some policy position, even whilst I'm rolling in there. And look, I was in hospital last week on some other issues that are related to that. And again, what struck me was a whole lot of issues around advocacy that I was dealing with that suddenly came to mind around, you know, and I've now dashed off a letter to the Minister for Health saying, look, I want to talk to you about all of these different areas that I've now experienced, but I'm not interested in how it's going to impact on me. I'm more interested in how it's going to impact on people with disabilities and people from a non-English speaking background and so on. And I want to know how you're dealing with those things.
You've been to hell and back, I suppose. Yeah. You've stared your own mortality in the face. What advice or what's been your greatest learning that you could pass on to someone who's perhaps going through something similar, maybe just been diagnosed or is awaiting the results and fearing the worst? What was your biggest learning through all of this?
I think one of the things that I keep reminding myself of is that I have these conditions, but there are people out there who deal with far worse. And I may at some stage get rid of all these conditions because medically all of those are issues that can be overcome. But there are lots of other people who can't. So if I can spend my time assisting those people, then I can look back and say, well, mine's a life well led. So, and well lived. So it's, I guess it's always saying, I guess it's saying to people that, yes, you may have conditions, but there are people out there dealing with far worse. And if we can somehow assist them, then we've done very well for the community in general. So that's all I'd be looking to say. And I think one of the things that drives me, and I must say that this is something that I probably just think about myself in terms of why do I go on to various committees, etc. It's because I know that my time is limited and my work is unlimited. And I have to fit all that work into that limited time. So there's this general fear that I'm not going to finish what I start. And that's why I keep going and getting into various committees, because I feel like I can assist there. And even if for a short time, I can at least make some change, then I have achieved what I want to do. I want someday that my kids will look back and say, well, if it wasn't for Dad, that piece of legislation would never have been put in place. Or if it wasn't for Dad, that event would never have occurred. So, and take some pride from that, So I look at the fact that, if I look back at the race space, for example, I spent 3 weeks in state parliament, eyeballing both sides of parliament until they made changes to the racial discrimination provisions of the criminal code, provisions that achieve what I wanted to do. It took me 3 weeks of daily attendance there, talking to both sides, arguing with them, and there's numerous references to me in Hansard around that. But that legislation then became the toughest legislation in Australia on racial vilification. And 50 years from now, when someone gets vilified, I want them to feel like, well, if it wasn't for Suresh, I wouldn't have protection. And that makes me feel good. So
let me just play devil's advocate for a moment, because I'm curious about this. This must come at a cost. I mean, you put a hell of a lot of your personal time, as you say, you've made it your focus to help externally, to help all these people, all these societies, all these groups. How do you reconcile that with your own family time? There must be an impact on the kids. Are they actually okay with it? Are they like, Dad's never here, he's always off helping all these other people? Or are they with you on this cause, and how have you managed that?
Look, my kids are relatively young. They're 16 and 14. One of the things that I've actually admired in my kids is that they both have extremely strong social consciences. They are...
I wonder where they get that from.
I can't imagine. They're passionate about refugee issues, as I am. They're passionate about, when the same-sex marriage debate was going on, they were absolutely passionate. They're passionate about people with epilepsy. So they, and people with disabilities, etc. So they've inherited a lot of that. So they understand when Dad said, "No."
Is that also because do they come with you to some of these events and functions and things that you go to, or how much do they get involved with what you're doing?
That's another story as well, which I might tell you now. But going back about 10 years ago, now there was a guy who took out a paramilitary operation to kill 3 people in the state, and I was one of the 3. The police commissioner and the attorney general were the other 2. The attorney general, Jim McGinty, the police commissioner, Carl O'Callaghan, and myself. So the reason was that he felt that I was some kind of rallying figure for the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and his best approach was that I be taken out of the equation. At that time, we had to go through a process advised by police to virtually distance myself from any family members so that any impact on me was not going to be an impact on the family. My son, my younger son, was only just born, and
that would have been a terrifying experience.
It was very frightening because we had police swarming through offices and police swarming through homes, checking our security, making sure. And the reality is that my car was damaged on about 5 occasions during that 1 year, when every time I made comment about refugees, the car would be either jacked up and all 4 tires slashed, or all the windows smashed, etc. And that was a constant that happened, again and again and again. So I try and distance my family from anything that I get involved in, because, and then look, even today I get numerous bits of hate mail every week, 50, 60 emails a week.
So they understand that, you've explained it to them?
Yeah, they fully appreciate that, and they understand that. And so I don't think they want to be involved to the extent that I am, but they certainly are very passionate, and they hear from me why I do these things. Um, Technology is a wonderful thing as well, and I use technology to its fullest extent, because I'm able to attend board meetings virtually, sorry, and it's all of those things that I can do without actually having to leave the place. I do travel a bit. I may do 10 to 12 trips a year away, but I've always engineered my trips so that I leave at midnight from here, get into the eastern state that I'm going to at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, go to an all-day meeting, and come back in the evening. So I'm away for a time when the kids are at school, but I'm back here to put them to bed, or back here to see them off or whatever. So it is always a case that I've tried to juggle that. That can have its impact, if you're doing all your trips at night and so on. It can't be good for your body, but it's I guess it's something that goes with the territory, and yet I know those impacts will be relatively minor. So long as I can make sure that I do involve my kids in everything that I do, and Liz, who's an incredible support as well, my wife. So and she will just make sure that the kids know where I am at any time, which helps a lot as well. But it can have an impact on you, I guess, in terms of your financial position, because you're never going to die rich in this position. You're always out there trying to make sure that everyone else is not going to die poor.
Yes, that's very interesting. So what I'm curious then about at what point did your children sort of become aware that you're creating a legacy, or you're aiming to create a legacy?
Look, fairly early in the piece. I think that they probably heard me speak about all these issues from a very, very young age. They used to come to some of the, when they were really little, I would take them along to a board meeting, or take them along to a refugee rally. So they're used to hearing these conversations around the rights of people.
So you really expose them to a lot that the average family member growing up in suburban Australia wouldn't probably even contemplate, unless their parents were involved in some kind of organisation like this.
And that's absolutely right, in that I look at some of the activists in the area, and I look at the involvement of their children in the area, and I'm staggered by how involved they are. So yes, generally you'll find that activists tend to involve, it becomes a family thing. But the average person in suburbia would not have that, because our focus has been so very much the opposite of what I've explained in terms of my focus. Our focus as a nation tends to be myself, my family,
yes,
and finally the community.
Definitely.
Whereas mine's the reverse, and it's that reversal that does not apply universally, which then goes to determine our attitudes as well. So yes, the average person in suburbia is saying, well, I have my needs met, and I want to make sure that my needs are met. That's fine.
So it seems like you're functioning on a more altruistic level, and most families are probably functioning more on a fear-based mentality of, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and so on, about, I've got to protect my family first, get shelter, food, and so on, and the higher level functions, the creativity and the self-actualization needs come later. You're almost kind of turning the pyramid upside down.
Yeah, I actually think the self-actualization need it needs to be paramount. For me, it's that actualization of achieving everything that I want to do. So it's about achieving success in all these different areas, and I want to achieve success. If that success is measured by the community's acceptance of someone, or a person's integration into a community, well, so be it.
So you're sort of selfishly pursuing unselfishness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, and I often say that, look, one of the reasons why I want to be involved in that is to satisfy myself.
Mm.
And my satisfaction comes from achieving success for the community.
Yeah.
So it is selfish, it is, but if there's an unselfish outcome from my selfishness, I'm happy about that.
Great. Something I wanted to just give a little time to is I know this is a cause that you're passionate about, and that is this whole issue of refugees and us as one of the leading, I like to think, leading countries in the world. We are in a position where we can help other people. Now, that self-actualization and putting your own family first. This is quite a divisive issue in Australia. We've got people saying, we should look after our own people first and bugger the people overseas. You've had first-hand knowledge of some of these people and seen what they're going through. Perhaps you could share something about that, because it might help change some people's perspectives on some of this.
Look, I've spent many years talking with people who've come here from a refugee background. And I guess let me start by saying that my simple philosophy is this. I believe that if we're going to pick a number that we're going to bring in on humanitarian grounds, and that number happens to be 13,500 now, and in most years we don't even achieve anywhere near that. So that's the number that we say will be the number that we will give places to. What goes to my thinking is that we need to process people within that time frame of saying, if they come in, they're one of the 13,500 or they're not one of the 13,500. Process them, either get them into the community or get them back to their countries of origin, if it's safe to do so. Where I have some difficulty is the concept of immigration detention centres, both onshore and in Manus and Nauru. And what I worry about there is this. In England, it takes 10 days to process anyone coming in on a refugee humanitarian basis. In France, it takes 6 days. Our average time is now sitting at about 283 days.
So what's causing that? Is it bureaucracy? Is it the fact that these people don't have any travel documents or any identification documents?
Yeah, refugees are exactly the same as they are in Britain and in France.
Right.
So, but what is it that's causing that? It is these issues of we're moving them offshore to places like Nauru and Manus and leaving it the responsibility of the local people to deal with. So the processing, we once went about 3 years without a single person being processed off Manus and Nauru. That's worrying. Why is that the case? Because we've taken a firm position to appease a number of people in the community that none of these people will ever come to Australia. Now, you then go to that position that Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand has said, we'll take them. And what we've said is that you can take them on condition that they will never be allowed to come back to us. Because once you go to New Zealand and you become a New Zealand citizen, you've got every right to come to Australia.
Of course, yeah.
But so that's the sticking point at the moment. So it is a philosophy that we've developed over many years and over many governments to say that they will not come to Australia. And that's why we've excised parts of Australia for immigration purposes. Christmas Island doesn't exist as part of Australia. Various islands don't. So if they come to those islands, they're not landing in Australia.
You mentioned a great point there, safety.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most fundamental reasons why a lot of these people are seeking refuge in Australia is where they've come from is really unsafe.
And the stories they tell of some of the issues that they've dealt with. I mean, I had a chap who came to see me from one of the African states, and after a conversation with me, he just simply said to me, I now declare myself a refugee to you. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't deal with this. I cannot process you. And I then put him in touch with the Red Cross and dealt with it that way. But he told of some horrendous crimes that occurred. There are 3 boys here that I deal with quite regularly who were part of a group of people that were taken into the police station and locked in the police station for 3 days, and they started to drink their own urine to survive. And at the third day, the police came around and just simply started firing machine guns into this. 3 of the boys who survived lay down on the ground and drew bodies over themselves, and they got out, and they're here. You imagine the trauma and the dealing with the mental health status of those kids, and they're young kids, 18, 20, etc. And I look at that. I know women who've seen their husbands. There was a classic one that we told the story of at one of the conferences I spoke at. She had her husband brought out before her at the refugee center, a gun to put to his head and his brain shot out, and she was made to drink his blood.
It's horrendous.
That is something you will never get over, you know. And I listen to those stories and I think, why am I denying her an opportunity to survive, an opportunity to live in a country that is going to give her everything she requires to be successful in bringing up her children? That's what I struggle with. That's what I think. We've got, they haven't. Why can't they take some of what we've got? Why can't I take some of what I've got and give it to them so that they can actually share in the same outcomes that I want? Why can't I lower my expectations so that they can get the same? That issue around why don't we deal with our homeless before we deal with these people? The person making that criticism was not talking to me about the homeless last week. Why is it suddenly a priority for you? Because we've got a refugee coming in.
Yes.
So it is, I guess, if I were to say that, it would be a different story, because I'm arguing the homeless issues now, whether there's refugees or not.
Yeah.
And so I think that I guess I go to that space to say, I really do believe there is enough for all of us out there. There's enough by way of our resources. I've argued long and hard that the minimum number that we should be looking at taking in is about 20,000 rather than the 13,500. And I will continue to argue that, and I've based it on the cost of those refugees, etc. But there are lots of things around refugee policy that we don't know. For example, we don't know what skills exist amongst all those people that are sitting in detention centres.
There can be some very talented surgeons or teachers or people that can contribute in massive ways to our society.
We used to have a chap who used to clean our offices at the Ethnic Communities Council, and he was his country's, his African state's ambassador to one of the neighbouring states. Now, none of his qualifications in politics were recognised here, so he's cleaning offices. And, I suddenly think, hey, look, isn't there something we could be using him in doing that's far more productive? There might be. There's a chap who's quite famous, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he's a surgeon, and he came through as a refugee.
So I was just going to say, give me some positive stories, Suresh, of how some of these people have been able to survive this ordeal of being a refugee, being processed, and then coming out the other end, and then contributing massively to our society.
I can look at one very young couple that I've helped along the way, and helped more in terms of believing in themselves. Husband and wife now. At the time they were in a relationship but hadn't married. Both had come here as refugee children. The husband is now a medical practitioner in the children's hospital. The wife is a lawyer in the human rights space. Both of them arrived here as refugees. And I look at that and think, that's fabulous. And to this day, both of them regard me as a mentor, and I'm really happy to take the time to give them to integrate into the community. and they now have children, and they are. So that's an example, and that is not to be seen as an isolated example. I mean, we can go back to refugees who came here post-war, and I look at the Frank Lowy, the chairman of Westfield. There are people like him who came here as refugees and have achieved enormous success in the business community. There are people out there who are medical practitioners, they are lawyers, they're pharmacists, etc. There's a couple of Vietnamese pharmacists that I keep in touch with, came here with no English and have just learned and become outstanding contributors to the community. So that's what we risk losing if we don't actually give them an opportunity to excel.
Well, our whole country's been built on migration, really, hasn't it? And bring in that's one of the great things. Do you see Australia as the kind of perfect role model of multiculturalism in the world, or?
I do, as we were the first adopters of multiculturalism, and the Canadians will argue with us till the cows come home as to whether they got it first. I think we got in by a few days. But look, the concept of multiculturalism also has evolved over time, and it is one of the things that's very admirable in Australia is that multiculturalism is a bipartisan policy. The one thing I will always say, though, is that I will advocate for multiculturalism until the cows come home, but I will not do so if it further disadvantages the First Nations people. My priority has always been to say the First Nations people are the people that I want to make sure achieve everything that they're entitled to achieve. If my arguments for multiculturalism disadvantage them, then I will not argue multiculturalism. But I believe that the First Nations people are an integral part of that multiculturalism, because even when you look at the First Nations people, there are so many tribes that they are already multicultural. They are incredibly multicultural. And I have spent years trying to understand and fully appreciate the culture and the history. And that's a history and culture we can't lose. So we must make sure that we preserve that, enhance it, and provide all the opportunities there. And once we've done that, then we can do that for the rest of the community. But it is one of the most successful creations of a very, very integrally harmonious society. And people often say to me, why don't you go to India and sort out the caste system? My response to them is that I do not live in India. And whatever I say is not about being critical of what it is here. It is about making it an even better place for my kids and for everyone else. And if I can do that, then I think I've achieved what I'm here to do.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Suresh, for today, for coming in and talking to us. I could listen to you talk all day, and I'm sure you've got enough stories that you could carry on talking all day. But I think you've already shown, certainly in my dealings with you, you're a man of integrity, and you're well respected. I know you can also possibly polarize some people, but that's because you're pushing the buttons, and you're helping us as a society look at the way we conduct ourselves. So thank you for the great work you're doing. Long may it continue. And all the best.
Thank you very much, Tony. Much appreciated.
Thank you.